Good evening. Good evening. My name is Małgorzata Bakalasz-Dyverge, and I'm the Director of Academic Programs at the Center for Jewish History. And on behalf of the Center, I would like to welcome you to our programs this evening. Tonight's conversation with Robert Alter and Adrienne Levine will be about the art of translating the Bible and beyond. And given the massive crowd we are all a part of here at the auditorium and in the Great Hall, as you have noticed, we have simulcast. Tonight's conversation clearly redefines what hot topics of the days are, which gives us some hope. Not too much, but some. Before we begin, I would like to share a few words about where we are tonight. To me, the Center for Jewish History is a rare gem in the city. It is a world-renowned research institution, a destination for educational and public programs, concerts, exhibitions, a place to explore genealogy, and the Center for Jewish History is also home to our 5 partner organizations and their extraordinary archival collections. Our partners: the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, together possess the largest repository of Jewish archival material outside of Israel. I think it's safe to say that most people walking by this unassuming building on West 16th Street have no idea that tucked away inside is an astonishing treasure trove of materials that spans 1,000 years of history and includes millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of books, thousands of artworks, ritual objects, recordings, and film. In other words, this building is quite literally filled to the brim with stories. And we can attempt to say that it is a story, or I should actually say the story, that gathered us tonight. But it would be nowhere near doing justice either to the conversation or to the discussants of tonight. I will then just quickly introduce both of them and let us all devour the fantastic and inspiring evening ahead of us. Professor Robert Alter is professor at the Graduate School and emeritus professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of more than 24 books, including the Hebrew Bible, a translation with commentary, on sale tonight. He is a recipient of Robert Kirsch Award for Lifetime Contribution to American Letters, among other awards, and he lives in Berkeley, California. In his new book, The Art of Bible Translation, which cost me many subway stops that I missed. So I just want to warn you, this is what's going to happen to you. Alter offers a personal account of what he learned about the art of Bible translation over the past 2 decades of his work. Alter provides an illuminating introduction to biblical style that also offers insights about the art of translation far beyond the Bible. Adrienne Levine, is senior lecturer in Hebrew Bible at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, having previously taught at Stanford University. Her books include Biblical Narratives of Israelites and Their Neighbors, Strangers at the Gate, and Memory and Tradition in the Book of Numbers. She has contributed to edited collections, including the Oxford Handbook to Biblical Narrative and Torah in the Book of Numbers. Please join us in the Great Hall after the program, following the Q&A, short Q&A, for a book sale, signing, and reception, and hopefully for more stories. Enjoy your evening.
So welcome everyone to this evening with Robert Alter. I want to start with some quotes from some of the reviews so you have some sense of what this is all about, as if you don't yet. The Wall Street Journal reviewer Eric Ormsby wrote, "Mr. Alter's translation is a credible successor to the King James Bible." Gary Rensburg wrote, "A landmark achievement deserving of great celebration. This remarkable undertaking will last for generations." Amen. Your colleague and friend Ronald Hendel also wrote in a symposium in the pages of the Jewish Review of Books that Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible, quote, "is the best and arguably the first literary translation of the world's bestseller," unquote. I especially enjoyed the picture in his desk in the New York Times Magazine feature interview. I think that was back in December, maybe. Your many students know that you have always worked, and this is a little known secret, best known secret, on a pad of lined paper with a pencil. And there it was in the New York Times photo, the pad of paper, the lines, and the pencil. Did you use a pad and a pencil to translate nearly 3,000 pages of the Hebrew Bible into English? Absolutely.
And I have to, it's not any pencil. It's a cross mechanical pencil made by a little company in Lincoln, Rhode Island, and I expect them to send me a whole batch of.
Well, that makes me wonder what will be next for the use of those pencils. But in the meantime, to say that your translation is quite an accomplishment would clearly be an understatement. 3,000 pages, 2.5 decades of work, only matched by hundreds of thousands of sales of Alter's Bible translations. So my first question really is, where did you find the wherewithal to translate one of the greatest works of literature ever known in this world?
Before I answer that directly, I just have to say, because this was not included in the gracious introduction, that Adrienne Levine was my student at Berkeley, and she is one of the reasons why I have loved to teach at Berkeley year after year. I get such wonderful students.
Thank you.
Well, the way that I had the wherewithal is that I never thought I was going to do it. that is, for various reasons, I tell the whole story in the preface to the book. I launched on a translation of Genesis, which I conceived as an experiment that I thought would not work. That is, I wanted to get much more of the literary subtlety and beauty and power of the Hebrew into the English language, and I figured you really can't do that because the two languages are so different in structure, in the meaning of key terms, and so forth. So I was dubious about what the result would be. It was better than I thought, and the book was well received. So I thought, okay, I'll do one more book of the Bible, and then forget it. So I did the David story, basically the book of Samuel, which is one of those wonderful narratives that produced anywhere in the ancient world. That also went well, and so then I did Psalms, and bit by bit I kept doing more books. I have to say, before Psalms, my editor at my publisher Norton came out to San Francisco, and as genial editors do, took my wife and me to a nice restaurant for dinner, and he said, well, do you think you want to do any more Bible translations? I'm enjoying it, and it's been well received. He said, what do you have in mind? I said, maybe a little volume of a few short books from the Bible that I really like Ruth and Esther and the Song of Songs. And he frowned, and he said, there's not, because after editors care about literature in the best cases, which he's the best case, but they also are business people. So he said, there's not much of a marketing framework for miscellaneous books of the Bible. So I said, well, what do you have in mind, Steve? He said, well, if we had our druthers, we'd love you to do the whole Hebrew Bible. And my response was the inevitable 4 words, give me a break. So we talked on and then raised the possibility, maybe he did, of doing the 5 books of Moses. And I did, after some weeks of hesitation, encouraged by my best friend and then by my wife who wanted to keep me off the streets, I agreed to do the 5 books of Moses. And what happened, I had not calculated that way, but it turned out to be what the cynics call a great career move. Because since people view the 5 books of Moses as the foundation stone of the whole Bible, it got reviewed everywhere and in places where it had never been reviewed before, like the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and so forth. So I went on to other things. And I still was telling myself, I can't do this whole thing, that's monstrous. But about 4 years ago, I looked at what I had done, and it was almost 2/3. So I said, I can really do this. I just have to get through the prophets. So that's on there.
Speaking of students, some of my students from HUC are here tonight, and they are getting through the prophets this semester, and some of it with thanks to you. So that is just terrific. The editors of the symposium said, quote, every major complete translation of the Hebrew Bible into English over the last half millennium has been, like the King James Version and the 2 JPS translations, a group project. But yours was a solo expedition, and I realized when I said expedition, I think I meant something by that journey that you were on. So I want to ask you, I'm sure everyone's curious, what was it like to take this on as a solo expedition, physically, emotionally, spiritually, getting more into the personal side of the translator in front of us?
Well, I've always liked to work alone. The 2 closest moments in my career when I did something like collaboration was my wife and I collaborated on a biography of Stendhal, the great 19th century French novelist, many years ago. But the way we collaborated was I wrote the draft of each chapter after we both did the research together, and then we discussed, sometimes argued over the draft. But as my wife Carol said at the time, you were invested in your prose and I'm not, so you do the writing. My other collaborative effort was a big, fat, not as fat as this, volume called The Literary Guide to the Bible, which I did with the eminent British literary critic Frank Kermode. And there I took charge. We had different contributors, and then we wrote a few of the essays. So he took charge of the New Testament and I of the Old Testament. We did write the introduction together, and he died about 2 years ago at a ripe old age. He was a very gracious person, and we got along well, and we managed to put together that joint introduction. But otherwise, I've always really liked writing by myself. I do talk to people, and I consulted my friend and colleague, who's a very learned Bible scholar, very smart person, Ron Hendel. He's also a good guitarist, I want everybody to know. For the very first part of it, I consulted quite closely my dear friend Amos Funkenstein, who, alas, died before the book came out of cancer. And I also at times consulted my wife. That is, she's not a Bible scholar, but she has a great sense of language. And I didn't give her drafts, but I talked about difficult word choices with her. And I'll give you one example where she saved me from disaster. In the 23rd Psalm, now probably everybody in this room knows the line from the King James Version, "Thou anointest my head with oil." And all the modern versions follow this. They say, you anointed my head with oil. The thing is, there are many points when I did this where I broke sharply from the momentum of translations. The Hebrew word does not mean to anoint. It's dishanta, which there's a different word for anoint. It comes from the same root from which we get Messiah, and it's used for only two things: for anointing high priests and for anointing kings. That's what they did rather than crowning. Well, if the poet had wanted to say anoint, he would have used that verb. But he used a verb that is associated with richness and luxuriance. It's a very much this worldly kind of word, as I think most of the poetry of the Bible is. So in my draft, this is embarrassing, but I'll share an embarrassment with you. My first draft, I said, "You pleasured my head with oil." And my very scrupulous wife said, "Don't do that." So I changed it to "You moisten my head with oil." Now, so I wasn't in total isolation, but I guess my contact with others as I worked on it was intermittent. But I enjoy working that way, so it wasn't emotionally hard or anything.
But were there other people in your head as you were translating, either alive or dead, that you would turn to have conversations or arguments with?
Yeah, well, first, somebody already mentioned that Amos Funkenstein. Maybe in order to do honor to the dead, I'm going to mention the three most brilliant people I've met in academic life. My very close friend, Michael Andre Bernstein, who was my colleague in comparative literature, who actually, I forgot that Michael read all the drafts and made some, he didn't know Hebrew, but he made some astute comments because he was an acute reader of literary style. So the Michael Bernstein, Benjamin Harshav, who died about 2 years ago, who was a professor of comparative literature at Yale and had involvement in the Evo Institute, which is located here. And the third most brilliant of these 3 billion people was Amos Funkenstein. And now he had a gift for thinking in new ways about things that everybody had always thought about in one way. I'll give you all an example. There's a long poem at the end of Genesis, and there's a line that reads, Dan will judge his people. Dan Yadin Amo. And it's hard to know what that means. And when I spoke with Amos, he said, it could well be the other way around in biblical grammar. It could mean Dan, his people will judge, as one of the tribes of Israel. And why would they say that? Because the tribe of Dan migrated to the north. It wasn't in its original tribal territory. So even though it had moved, his people would still consider it to be one of the tribes of Israel. I think that was a brilliant insight, and I translated it that way. So afterwards, Amos was no longer with me, but I tried to internalize that. That is, to push myself to ask questions. Well, everybody has always read this word or this sentence in such and such a way. Is that inevitable? Maybe there's another compelling way to do it. So that was helpful.
I love that. My students are struggling with translating themselves, so sometimes they're trying to figure out why it would be this way rather than that way. But when you say you try to push yourself to think about it in ways that others might not have, which others? Are we talking about medieval commentators? Are we talking about the group committee? I won't mention the JPS. We're not going to go there. But the group committee, let's say, in the Revised Standard Version, or...
Yeah, I would say I was thinking to some extent of the King James Version, which is really wonderful in certain ways. Of course, it makes a lot of mistakes, and this has been known for a while. It has other problems, but I won't go into that. But I was thinking especially of the all the modern translations by committee. And okay, shall I give one example? Yes. There's a line in Psalms which says, in the King James Version, I think all the moderns follow it, the speaker is addressing God, and he says, in all the other translations, my soul thirsts for you as in a parched land without water. Now, first of all, I don't use the word soul at all because I don't think that there's a biblical conception of soul. And usually it means something like life breath. But by extension, it actually means throat or neck, because the throat is the passageway for the life breath. When I looked at the context, I said, as beautiful as that line sounds, my soul thirsts for you, look at the context. It's a parched land without water, and in the next line, it's parallel to my flesh. So it's my whatever, my my flesh. So I thought the meaning here that's relevant is throat. My throat thirsts for you. Now, it's a little shocking to say my throat thirsts for God, but I think that's probably what it meant. And it does have a poetic power, but different from the one we're used to.
I'm sure everyone's wondering about the comment about the soul. And I know that when people find out that I know you, they always say to me, does he really think there isn't a soul in the Bible? So I think it's time to answer that yourself.
Okay.
So I can quote you in the future, please.
Okay, well, to begin with, keep in mind that the notion of an afterlife, which tends to be connected with soul, doesn't appear in the Hebrew Bible, with the exception of an intimation in the last book written in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel, which is very late. It's like the 160s before the Common Era. And the word nefesh, really, its basic meaning is breath. And actually, it sounds a little like that, nefesh, right? And by flipping the consonants, you get nashaf, which means to pant. So since there was no notion of a split between body and soul, the nefesh, the life breath, which is what animates the body when it's alive. You know, we've all seen those police procedural movies where they find somebody who's been shot and they put something by his nostrils to see if it flutters, if there's still life breath. That's exactly what the nefesh is, and so I was very consistent about that.
Well, I'm really curious about this, but I think I should probably go on and ask you yet another question, which has to do with, I want to read to you, some of the quotes I'm reading are from the Art of Bible Translation for the audience to pick up on. And this quote says that the Bible itself does not generally exhibit the clarity to which its modern translators aspire. The Hebrew writers reveled in the proliferation of meanings, the cultivation of ambiguities, the playing of one sense of a term against another, and this richness is erased in the deceptive antiseptic clarity of the modern versions, unquote. That was all Alter's language, beautiful. And I want to ask you, what's wrong with offering us a Bible as if it was written the day before yesterday? Or, in other words, why do we need another translation?
Okay. Well, I'll begin with the particular reason for another translation that you raised, and I'll go on to something general. I think that it diminishes the Bible to make it read as though it were a weekly news magazine or a bureaucratic memorandum issued yesterday or the day before yesterday. Because you wouldn't want to read Homer that way. You wouldn't want to read Homer as though it were a poem composed in the year, let's say, 2015. So I do a number of things to avoid this impression. You obviously can't use a lot of corny, archaic terms, forsooth, and that sort of stuff. But what you can do is avoid any terms that sound very contemporary. Okay, let me take an example. Words for sex. Now, you read the modern translations by committee, and they'll say, be intimate with, have relations with, cohabit, and all those sound too modern to my ear, and they violate the integrity of books produced in Iron Age 2, to put an archaeological label on it. So I pretty much follow, as the King James does, the contours of the Hebrew idiom, like to lie with, to know, and to to enter I modified slightly, but I stay close to it anyway. So that is one reason why I want to avoid that impression, and why I think that modern translations that do the opposite need to be replaced. Now, the other overriding consideration has to do with literature. And let me put it this way. Some of you may suspect that I'm some kind of literary nut, because you know the Bible's a religious book. Well, what are you talking about literature? And that I'm maybe distorting the Bible by the emphasis on literature. I think the opposite is true, that for reasons that we will never fathom, this dinky little culture sandwiched in a small slice of land between great empires to the west, to the east and to the south, a culture with a very primitive visual art and various architecture and so forth. They produced literary geniuses. And these literary geniuses, okay, they were monotheists, and they did want to convey in their writing, in their poems, and in their stories, a new sense of the world, of a new kind of God, a notion of a covenant between God and Israel, a different take on creation, on history, and maybe even the moral realm. But they chose to do this in extremely artful narrative and in often great poetry. And my feeling is that even if your motive for reading the Bible is not at all literary, but strictly religious, if you want to tune in the full complexity of what these writers were saying about the world, you have to get a sense, a much better sense than the previous translations have afforded, of the literary vehicle in which it's all conveyed. So that's really what impelled me to do this.
Well, you jumped ahead in my questions, by the way.
Okay,
I gave you that
sorry.
quote about the small kingdom, the provincial little kingdom. I really love that quote. And you also made another point in the Art of Bible Translation, saying something like the extraordinary imaginative use of language that has very few equals in the whole ancient world, and none among the geographic neighbors of ancient Israel, unquote. You give as an example, actually, Homer, in which nobody ages or changes in the way that King David is portrayed in the books of
Right.
Samuel. And I loved your translations of the books of Samuel, and when I teach them, I often use those translations as they work through the Hebrew, because you really capture something about who this hero and his flaws are in that book. And it just struck me because you see David first as a very young man and then
Right.
at the end of his life. And so when you said that about Homer, I was really struck by that. Homer really doesn't show you that development of character over time.
Right, now, I have to say to be that I hadn't remembered it at the time, but there's a work of criticism which for my money remains the greatest work of literary criticism written in the 20th century, and it's Erich Auerbach's Mimesis. And there's a famous first chapter that compares a passage from the Odyssey with a passage from Genesis, the binding of Isaac. And in the end, he makes the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, to be the true beginner of the tradition that culminates in the realism of the novel, and not Homer. Well, at one point he doesn't mention David, he mentions Jacob, and it's equally true of Jacob. He said, we see Jacob from a striving, shrewd, physically powerful young man to an old man who's at the mercy of his sons, which I better watch out. One of my sons is here, and I'm not a young man. And he says that Odysseus is the same person every day of his life, and look at the difference. So it is the same insight.
Okay. But I want to get at this because I was so struck by this. Anyone who will read the Bible slowly and carefully with your commentary, your translations, or if you also can have access to it in the Hebrew, word for word, it really becomes so rich and so, outstanding and exceptional. I wanted to try to get you to help us understand how this group of writers over a period, right? They didn't all write in one decade, maybe
No.
4, 5, 6, 800 years.
Right.
How did they capture that kind of subtlety and nuance and ambiguity which you have always brought out for us when we read with you and study with you?
Well, some of it, of course, is a mystery that we'll never solve. But I would offer one partial example, and it's a monosyllabic word, prose. That is, okay, we think prose. I'm reminded of the famous moment in Moliere's play in 17th century France when the pretentious characters, oh, I'm speaking prose, which isn't quite true because prose is something that is wrought. But here's the story. Most ancient cultures, certainly those that arose in the Mediterranean, their first stories are all in poetry. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, well, we know about Homer that there were performances with a stringed instrument, and the stringed instrument accompanied a regular sequence of long and short syllables, so it had a rhythm to it, and that's the way it was composed, with the musical instrument. The literacy goes back very far in the ancient Near East. Apparently the alphabet was invented about 1800 BCE. And somehow or other, it dawned on writers in ancient Israel to take advantage of this new alphabetic medium, which facilitated writing, because hieroglyphs and cuneiform involved the memorization of thousands of signs, whereas here you just had 22 letters in the alphabet. So it occurred to them that they could sit down at a table with a roll of parchment and a pen and ink and start writing. And when you write that way, you have the freedom to stop and start and say, wait a minute, I'm not going to use that word, I'm going to use another word, or something that happens again and again in biblical narrative. I just used that word, now I'm going to use it again 2 sentences later, but an entirely different meaning, and the two meanings are going to clash and interact and enrich each other. So that all stems from prose writing. And I would also carry this into dialogue. That is something, Auerbach does not talk about this, and I did not think about it when I wrote a book on biblical narrative a long time ago, but the true precursor of dialogue in the novel is dialogue in the Hebrew Bible. What do I mean by that? Unlike Homer, there are great speeches in Homer, but everybody has to speak in these metrical forms. In dactylic hexameter is the name of the meter, and for that reason, people often in Homer give speeches rather than dialogic exchanges. The speeches can be very eloquent and moving, but they're speeches. Whereas in the Bible, language is very often bent in the dialogue to reflect the relation of one speaker to another, the character of the speaker, sometimes even the social position of the speaker, and all that is novelistic.
Wow, thank you. I want to go on because what you're getting an example of, folks, from Professor Alter is something that he calls an answering art in translation. So I want to get a little bit into that translation. First, what you mean by an answering art in translation. And I did make a list of the topics you take up in the art of Bible translation, which include syntax, diction, word choice, sound play, wordplay, rhythm. And I wondered if you could describe that answering art by giving us an example from any one of those categories I just mentioned. You've been doing that already, but maybe a little bit longer.
Maybe I'll choose 2 categories. Is that okay? Okay. Both from early Genesis, where I quickly discovered what I needed to do, which I wasn't entirely sure of when I set out. Halfway through the first chapter of Genesis, and this is an example I give in the book, you have a report of God creating the sun and the moon. And the way it reads in my translation, this is half a sentence. He created the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. Then I stopped myself short. I said, why did I say dominion? That's a little nutty. That is, all the translations say something like to govern, to rule over, and so forth. So my first motive, evidently, for saying dominion was that it's not an infinitive, if you still remember your parts of speech in school, but it's a verbal noun, a noun derived from a verb. So I use dominion. And there's one translation, I will mention the Jewish Publication Society, that actually says to dominate the day. which it's a tin ear for English. That is, the Soviet Union dominated the small states of Eastern Europe after the Second World War. The sun does not dominate the day, right? But then I thought a little bit more about my choice, and I realized that what really impelled me to do it was the rhythm. I'm now going to say those words in the Hebrew, and then I'll repeat my English. Et ha'ma'or hagadol lememshelet hayom, v'et ha'ma'or hakaton lememshelet halayla v'et hakochavim. And when I realized, the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night and the stars. So it's virtually the same cadence. So why does that have any importance? A skeptical person might say, well, it's a little icing on the cake, but it doesn't really matter. I think it matters a lot. That is, all great literary prose has rhythm. It's the beating heart of the prose. And the rhythm usually has implicit meaning. Like the rhythms of Moby Dick have implicit meanings. I won't go into it because I could give a half-an-hour lecture on Moby Dick, a book I love. So what the priestly writer who is responsible for this first version of creation had a sense not shared by his predecessor, the J writer, that creation was a beautiful, orderly set of events, a kind of choreographed progression. And the sense of order and harmony is phonetically embodied in that beautiful cadence. And without the cadence, you're not quite getting what it is. Okay, now a smaller example, still in Genesis, when the flood is about to start, Noah's flood, there's a little poem, it's a one-line poem, which in my translation reads like this. Then the casements of the heavens were open, and the well springs of the deep burst forth. Okay, so why casements? That's kind of a peculiar word. Well, there is a word that appears, I don't know, maybe 70, 80 times in the biblical corpus, chalon, which means window. And that's the standard modern Hebrew. Those of you who know modern Hebrew, you'll recognize it's the standard modern Hebrew word for window. But the writer in this little poem didn't use that word. He used a word, arubot. Now, my greatest aid in translating the Bible is the Hebrew concordance of the Bible. I trust that much more because it allows me to make my own judgments. I trust it much more than I trust. Okay. I don't always trust the standard lexicon of biblical Hebrew. I think that it makes wrong judgments. So the word arubot appears maybe 9 times in the Bible, and 7 out of the 9 times it's poetry. So I thought, this is poetic diction. And in fact, there's a good chance it's slightly archaic diction, as some of the poetry is, because it appears in an earlier Semitic text, or it's a close cognate. So instead of window, I chose casement, and this will, I know it's going to lose those of you in the audience who didn't study English literature, but my apologies. If you go back a couple of centuries in English poetry, casement appears in a poem by Keats. Casement appears quite a few times in Shakespeare. So it's not an unknown word, but it's literary and it's kind of old-fashioned. And I liked it just for that reason, because since it's a poem, the choice of that word in the Hebrew gave the poem a kind of elevation, and I wanted to give an elevation in the English.
Thank you. Speaking of making these kinds of choices, I did want to ask you if you could give us an example of one or two significant compromises that you made with your own principles in translating, which means I guess you have to tell us a little bit about what those principles are,
Oh, yeah.
and when you felt you had to throw them out the window to get it right somehow in the English.
Okay, two things. One, this is a general example. My overall approach was to try to use the same English equivalent for a particular Hebrew word wherever it appears. But sometimes I couldn't do that, because by using the same equivalent, it would be a little bit silly. So here's an example. At the beginning of the creation story in Genesis 2, we have a word Adamah, which I translated as soil. It's the material out of which Adam, there's that etymology between Adam and Adamah. Adam, the first human being, is fashioned. So I tried wherever I could to translate Adamah as soil, but there are clearly places where it means something like country or land, and I had to knuckle under and do that. Okay, now also I went and announced it here in this assembled company. I'm a big literalist as a translator, even more literal than the King James Version, I think. But there were a few places where I surrendered literalism. I'll give you one example. Isaiah, a remarkable poet, one of the things that he does quite often is to take a Hebrew word and to put it together with another Hebrew word that sounds quite like it but means the opposite. And this is his way of dramatizing it as a poet, how values have been perverted 180 degrees in the kingdom of Judah. There's a line of poetry in the 5th chapter of Isaiah. The he in this line is God, which Isaiah writes, he hoped for justice, and the word for justice is mishpat. And look, a blight, but the Hebrew word for a blight is mispach. So you have this play of opposites, mishpat, mispach. And I thought that was really, if I didn't reproduce that, I would be blunting the point of Isaiah's prophecy. So I translated the first half of the line. I think this is all right. He hoped for justice, and look, jaundice. Okay, jaundice is a kind of blight, so I don't think that was too much of a liberty. But then I got in a little bit of trouble in the second half. The second half says, for he, again, it's the he hoped, for righteousness, and the word for righteousness is tzedakah, and look, a scream, tza'akah. So you go from tzedakah to tza'akah. So I thought, I got to reproduce something of that sound play. But I did something that has two disadvantages, abandoning my principle of literalism. The first, and then I'll explain why I abandoned it. The first is that I said, he looked for righteousness and look, wretchedness. Okay, so you get the sound play, but of course, if you're screaming, you're probably wretched, so it's not totally out of the ballpark, but still it's not the same thing. And the sense of violence in Scream is entirely lost. So here's what you have to do all the time as a translator. In a great literary work, you will often see 2 or 3 important things happening in a phrase or even in a single word. And they won't all work in translation. So it's a matter of triage. You're going to say, which effect am I going to surrender because I think another effect is more important? And so I came to the decision, which some of you might disagree with, that's legitimate, that the really important thing was the sound play of tzedakah, righteousness, tzedakah, scream. So I gave up the literalism in order to get a sound play.
Okay, thank you. As long as you're mentioning Nevi'im, the prophets, you did say to us earlier this evening that that was your last great frontier in your expedition, your solo expedition. So could you talk to us a little bit about some of the particular challenges you had in translating? There's, the great prophets Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and then you mentioned Isaiah. There's first Isaiah, second Isaiah.
Third Isaiah.
Well, debate about the third Isaiah. I don't think we need to go into that here. But I do want to understand a little bit from you, and I'm sure everyone else, what were some of the challenges? These prophets can sometimes be so angry, right? And foreboding and ruthless. How do you manage all of that along with the magnificent poetry that they all speak? Okay.
To begin with, there's a kind of mechanical challenge, which is the quantity of the prophets is huge. It's, I think, easily double that of the 5 books of Moses. So that just thinking about the quantity was kind of daunting. The prophets are not invariably agreeable types. And I'll tell you the one who bothered me most was Ezekiel. Because I think Ezekiel probably was what we today would call a clinical case. Really. For example, he lay on one side for, I think, 390 days without moving, and then he turned over and he lay I forget how many days, on the other side. And I believe he really did this, and he said that God had bound him so he couldn't move. For me, the only explanation is that there was some kind of hysterical paralysis. But he's often very grim, and he's particularly negatively obsessed with the female body. And there are a couple of horrific chapters on the female body in Ezekiel. So you have to say to yourself in your chance, well, you wouldn't necessarily want to invite this guy to dinner, but that's who he was. And for better or for worse, the people who put together the Bible decided he deserved to be there. And you have to represent him in translation the way he was.
Who gave you the most pleasure or the easiest translation of those prophets?
Let me see. Maybe the first of the many Isaiahs. Okay.
Why?
I'm not going to go into technical detail, but books in the Bible, of course, they weren't bound books, but they were scrolls that were passed around. They were open-ended things. So writers and scribes felt free to stick into older books pieces of other books. And this is extreme in the case of Isaiah, where there seem to be 3 important prophets who lived at different times over a century and a half apart, whose work is sewed together. And then there are little bits and pieces which probably are for still other hands. And at least for the big three, I speak in tennis terms where we have the big four, the style is somewhat different. So I try to get that.
Okay, I'm looking at the time too. I know we don't have all of the night. Not 2 more minutes. 2 more questions. I'm going to ask 3, but the third one will be very quick.
I'll try to be brief in my answer.
No, please. One is on the reader. I think I'm curious, and probably our audience, you mentioned before, people are really fascinated by this project and about the idea that there's a new English translation. I know that you wrote that one of your critiques of other modern translators is that they seem to think the modern reader needed to have everything explained to them, and you were not going to do that. So what I'm wondering about with you is what kind of assumptions did you have about the reader? Was there a reader in your head, and were those assumptions confirmed or challenged by the responses you've been given? I know that lots of people have written you emails and stopped you in the street, etc.
Okay. Your first question had to do with my objection to translations that explain the Bible. One wonderful email I got from a minister in the Church of Scotland said that his wife complained about the previous modern translations, that they're bossy translation, which is wonderful. In other words, they tell you what you're supposed to think the original means rather than showing you what the original says. So in a way, those translations are dumbed down. And my assumption is that the reader doesn't have to have a PhD in either literature or biblical studies, that most people are reasonably intelligent and can figure things out for themselves. And I'll give you one example. The modern versions have an underlying assumption which I find dumbfounding, that nobody can understand a metaphor anymore. So I'll give you one example. When Joseph, so what they do is they take the metaphor and they substitute for it what they think the metaphor refers to. So when Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt, remember they don't recognize him because he looks like an Egyptian potentate and is speaking to them through an interpreter. He accuses them of being spies. And in my translation, which follows the original quite closely, it's to see the nakedness of the land you have come. Now, the modern, a couple of modern versions I looked at say something like this: "You've come down to spy the weak points in our defense." Yeah, right. Now, let me say what I think is lost by this. The naked, but by the way, someone who's vaguely familiar with the Bible will recognize that this idiom, "to see the nakedness," is an idiom used for taboo sexual relations. You shall not see your mother's nakedness. Incest taboo. So what the metaphor says, and it's very powerful, is that you're coming to look at things here in Egypt that should never be exposed, that an alien eye should never take in. And to change that to the weak points in our defense just denatures the original. So I am assuming that readers, they don't have to be geniuses, but they're reasonably smart. They can figure things out. I've gotten a really very large number of enthusiastic responses to the translation from a wide variety of readers, Christians of various different denominations, Jews, secular people, and they seem to be getting it.
Yeah, I would think. Okay. I have one question I was particularly eager to ask you, and then I have one final question. And this question, I think about this, those of you who really love literature and are very engrossed, let's say when you read a novel or when you read the Hebrew Bible very closely, let's say you have a favorite book that you read over and over perhaps, you have a sense of relationship. And perhaps it's projected to the writer of that novel, or here, not necessarily God, but the biblical writers.
Yeah.
And when you spend so much time, which you have done over 2 decades,
Right.
in this literature of many different writers, I am just really curious if you ever felt in this time of company, right? You spent time in the company of these writers. Did you have a sense almost of touching the consciousness of that writer, or getting some sense so, separated by thousands of years?
Yeah.
Who was this writer? How did this writer perceive the world? I'm sure you were very acutely aware of his distinctive language and how one writer wrote differently than another. I'm sure of that. But did you also have a sense of his preoccupations, even how he felt if he witnessed God in the world, which our prophets all claim to have done? How did you get that? And did that enter your translation at all, or was that just between you and the writer?
Well, I think it was mostly between me and the writer, but it probably varied for different writers. For example, the author of the David story, I consider to be a flat-out genius. I kind of sense this person, I think he's probably, in all likelihood, a male person, to have been very worldly, very unillusioned about how people behaved in the political realm, about the struggle for power and how it leads people to do terrible things, how power corrupts. So he's a kind of very sophisticated, worldly realist, and I would be happy to have him as a dinner guest, although I'd be slightly nervous that he would see right through me.
That's great. Oh boy. Okay, on a personal note, as if that wasn't personal enough, spending all this time in the Hebrew Bible, I just assume, but I'd like to know if that assumption is at all correct. How has it changed you, and in what kinds of ways?
That's a hard one.
It's my last.
Yeah, okay. I'm probably a person who's changed over the decades less than some other people do. I would honestly say that what has changed me over the decades more than anything else is my wife, rather than a book that I've been involved with.
That's probably a good thing, right?
Yeah. I suppose the one thing, whether this changes me as a person or not, I don't know, but maybe many of us, and this was a kind of unthinking assumption somewhere at the back of my mind, tend to assume that as time goes by and culture changes and we will all become modern people, things get more sophisticated, things get more subtle, more complicated, and this it really started even before my Bible translation. When I started working on biblical narrative, I came to realize, especially getting up close, sentence by sentence, to the ancient narratives, that these people were every bit as smart as we are, and they developed subtle and sophisticated ways of representing the world that we scarcely would have imagined.
Thank you very much.
Let me just say, I wouldn't like to impose what kind of relationship those of you who are going to read the Bible in Robert Alter's translation are going to develop and with which author. But if you are going to buy this book, then the situation is clear. You know, we know exactly which author to wink at. Remember the subway stops you're going to miss. We are going to have a very, very short Q&A, and the reason for that is because we're going to have a lot of book signing, I'm sure, and we're going to have a reception, and we're going to have a lot of times to actually schmooze and talk and continue our conversations. That's why we will only take 4 questions. There is no mercy.
I was wondering if you're a religious individual and whether, if you are religious, that would stand in your way, a reverence for what you're reviewing just as, instead of as a piece of literature. And my other part of the question is, since there was no editor for the Bible, what was the literary quality of the Bible? Did you hit peaks and troughs with respect to, you know, this is tremendous, this is not that great? Those are my 2 questions.
Okay, now, to be perfectly honest, while at a younger age I tried to be a religious person, it did not quite work. I do have a sense of positive connection with Jewish tradition, and you know, we celebrate the holidays in our home and so forth. But I basically approached the task as a literary person, and this is what came out. But what, for the reason that I laid out a little earlier about the intrinsic connection between literary form and the religious vision of the ancient writers, it does seem that my translation speaks to very serious religious people. I mean, I get emails from pastors who say, now there's a Bible I can use in my sermons, which I didn't have in mind, but there it is. Now, the Bible is a mixed bag. What I'd like to remind everybody in the room is, even though we call it the good book and various other, the greatest book that was ever written, etc., it's actually not a book. It's an anthology. And it's an anthology that if you go back to the oldest poem incorporated in the Bible to the latest narrative text, spans almost 1,000 years. So not surprisingly, there is unevenness, there's boilerplate stuff. The last book in the according to the Jewish order of the canon is Chronicles. And Chronicles, I have to say, was a chore to translate. You know, the first 9 chapters of the book of Chronicles is nothing but an uninterrupted list of names. So you could be a genius like Michelangelo and you can't do much with that. So there's unevenness in the Bible, but actually the thing that I find bracing is that there's also extraordinary variety in the Bible. This is somewhat different from the New Testament, which was written, most of it, within everything within a few decades. So we have, you know, delightful and ripely sensual love poetry in the Song of Songs. You have something carnivalesque and satiric in the Book of Esther, and then you have these dissenting worldviews in Job and in Ecclesiastes, and so the variety is a terrific aspect of it. Isabella.
Yes, as a translator, I mean, every word you said is transporting me. I have a question about...
I should say that the questioner is herself a professional translator.
I have a question about the problems that you solved, and you had so many problems. Did you have a temptation to go and see how other literalists like Shuraki or Meshonik have solved this problem in their translation?
Oh, that's a good question. Now, I tried to keep myself honest. That is, when I translated a particular passage, I would not look at another translation. And sometimes I never looked at another translation, but then not infrequently I'd go over a passage and there would be, say, one word that bothered me. This didn't sound right. It's not quite the right word. And I'd look at 3 or 4 or 5 translations, and sometimes, not invariably, oh yeah, they figured out a nice English equivalent that didn't occur to me. And I didn't consider it to be plagiarism to borrow a single word. But generally, and here's a kind of comical thing. I mentioned before that like the King James Version, I'm quite literal, and that like them, I tend to follow the contours of the Hebrew syntax in the narrative. It happened maybe 2 or 3 times that after translating a verse, I looked at the King James Version and discovered I had reinvented the King James Version.
How did you deal with the problem of a word that appears only once in the Bible? If there's no parallelism to guide you. Now, I'll give an example that I hope I'm correct on.
Yeah, go ahead.
In the story of Ehud, when he assassinates the king of Moab, we have the words Vayetze,
Pashdana, right?
Haprosdona,
Oh.
which I believe appears only once. And there's no parallelism there to guide you.
Right.
So what do? And can you give us maybe 2 or 3 more examples of this problem?
Okay.
And how you dealt with it?
Let me comment on that one. Again, translating the Bible is not at all like translating a novel by Flaubert. Because, we pretty much understand 19th century French. It's not a language removed from us as biblical Hebrew is by 2,500 to maybe in the oldest cases, almost 3,000 years. So if a word appears only once or twice or 3 times, we may never recover its meaning. And usually you have to grasp at context. Like in this story of the assassination of the Moabite king, Ehud, the assassin, makes his escape in some obscure way. And since we don't know a lot, even with the help of archaeology, the floor plan of Moabite palaces, all we can say is there has to be some kind of architectural element. Maybe it's a corridor or something like that. So you just do guesswork by context. But then sometimes you can do detective work and come up with something. I'll just give one example. It was kind of a fun discovery of mine. It's a word that appears twice in the whole Hebrew Bible. Is that okay for you? Okay. I don't want to make it too easy on myself. In the Samson story, Samson, I'll remind the audience of the details. He marries this Philistine woman and is obliged to invite 30 male wedding guests. And he makes a wager with them. If they can solve his riddle, he will give each of them a chalifat begadim, which is clear in meaning. It means a change of garments. Then they solve the riddle by extorting the solution from his wife, and he's outraged. He storms down to Gaza, kills 30 Philistines, and what does he take from them? He takes 30 chalitzot. Now, it sounds rather like chalifot, but the middle consonant is different. So every English translation that I've looked at figures it's a kind of garment. And they say tunic, they say garment, one says for some reason belt. I don't think they had belts. A slight problem. And I said, that's not right. So I looked at the only other instance in the Hebrew Bible where this noun appears. It's in the civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul after Saul's death. Saul's savvy general, Abner, is being pursued by a very fast runner named Asael. And he doesn't want to kill Asael because he knows that will make bad blood between him and Asael's brothers. So he says, turn you to the right or to the left and strike down one of the lads and take his chalitza. Same word as in the Samson story. Now, all the modern translations say tunic, belt, a garment, whatever. And when I looked at that, I said, that's totally wrong. I mean, we've all read Homer, and whether the Septuagint read Homer, they were Greeks, and they got it. What in the Iliad, when a warrior slays an enemy on the battlefield, what does he take from him? He doesn't take his clothing, he takes his armor. You remember Hector takes Achilles' armor, which is being worn by Patroclus when Hector kills Patroclus. And then it occurred to me, then I started thinking etymologically. The biblical word for military vanguard is chalutz, same verbal root. So the guys in the chalutz, in the military vanguard, were wearing chalitzot, maybe some kind of special armor. Now I take that back to the Samson story. I correctly translated as armor, but that throws an interesting light on the Samson story. What did Samson do? He went beyond the terms of the bet. He stormed down to Gaza, where trouble is always brewing, and he killed not 30 Philistines, but 30 Philistine warriors. And he brought back not 30 changes of garments, but 30 sets of armor, which is far more valuable, is sort of sticking it to the Philistine wedding guests, and also a kind of warning to them. You guys see what I can do? Don't mess with me. So.
Hi, my name is Jill Rubin. I'm one of Dr. Levine's students at HUC. And first I want to say we have used your translation every day in class, and it's been really helpful for us, so thank you so much for that. And I'm curious about your use of masculine God language in your translation. And I wanted to know, it's a modern translation. I know you talked about staying true to the ancient nature of the text, but why, for 21st century, why do we still need to use he for God?
Why do you use what for God?
He or him.
Oh, yes. Now, I have to say, you're the second person to ask me this question. I was at a talk like this in London about 3 weeks ago with a very amiable person, and he said, I want to ask you one more question. My 12-year-old daughter, and it was the same question. So here is, there are gender-inclusive translations of the Bible. I don't know if there may be a complete one. I read a Catholic one, which is in some ways not bad, of Psalms. I think that a translator has to be honest about what the ancient text is saying, even if there are aspects of the ancient text that are not congenial to some values that are very important to us. So it is absolutely unambiguous in the Bible that God is He. And in fact, when God appears accompanied by two divine messengers at Abraham's tent in Genesis 18, he looks just like a man, not like a gender-neutral person or a woman, but like a man to Abraham. So I don't think that in the mind of the ancient Hebrews that there was any question of the gender of God. And I think we just have to be honest and render it that way, even if it might make us, at least on a theological level, a little uncomfortable.
Thank you.
This was number 4. And there is no mercy. Moreover, at each feast, we should stand up from the table, not exactly full, especially that the feast continues. And I would like to invite you to move to the Great Hall for the reception, book signing. Thank you so much.